Bismillah, bismillah. Okay, everyone, we're gonna get started. Gonna get started here. Yes. So, Bismillah, in the name of God, the most gracious, most merciful. My name is Ismail Royer. I am director of the Islam and Religious Freedom Action Team at the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. We're a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to promoting and securing religious freedom for everyone, everywhere. One of the projects that we do, or one of our goals, is to advance religious freedom in America and around the world. And in America, what we do are projects like this. We're very blessed to have with us today three fascinating attorneys, and I'm also, it's also interesting, I actually only just realized this, that we have 4 women. It didn't even really, the significance of that did not even occur to me, but that in of itself is very important. Of different faiths, all of whom are going to describe to us how their faiths, they're all different in their, these three attorneys that we have are different in their religions. We have one who is Catholic Christian, one is Protestant Christian, and we have a Muslim, all of whose religions inform their notions of the common good and the duty that we have towards one another. And Miriam is going to talk more about this, but we cannot live in a diverse society, and we cannot live together in America unless each one of us, regardless of our religion, regardless of whether we have no religion at all, our different ethnicities and our different genders and national origins, we have no way of being able to live together unless we recognize that we are part of a common project, and that what is good for me is good for you, and what is good for you is good for me, and what is bad for me and is also what is bad for you, as opposed to this poisonous notion that we see overtaking our country, and this notion that we have a sort of that civil society is a zero-sum game, that my win is your loss and your win is my loss. That's a poisonous way of thinking, and the end result of that is only the disintegration of our polity and of our civilization. So that's what we're doing here today. We're trying to fight that. It's a small step. But it's an important step. And the topics that these distinguished attorneys are going to speak about are diverse in their subject, but yet they all, we specifically chose these topics because there is so much common ground to be found across the spectrum on each of these topics. And so we're going to hear from them. And one other thing that's very important to mention is the importance in American tradition that faith plays in public life. We do not live in a society that requires faith to be put into a box and left at home, and something that is to be ashamed of, something that is to be something that is not to be mentioned in public. Rather, the founding fathers saw religion as something that was not only a belief in the heart, but also something that was to be lived, and that could inform our daily lives and the way that we lived our lives. And so that's what we're going to hear today. We're going to hear about how faith can inform our careers and can inform, and specifically, legal advocacy. So I'm going to introduce Miriam Battar. Miriam is Miriam, what is your actual? I know Miriam because she was an intern at the Religious Freedom Institute. Yes.
And the program coordinator of Houston Law Firm is at
Yes, actually.
I am the secretary
Of the Muslim Law Students Association. And by the way, before I let Miriam take over, I just want to extend my gratitude to the Muslim Law Students Association, Christian Legal Society, branches here at University of Connecticut, as well as to Islamic Relief for providing the grant that made this event possible. And all of us, suffice to say, all of these diverse groups are strong supporters of the common good, the notion of the common good, and the common good in America. So take it away, Marian.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so nice to see the beautiful faces. And thank you so much for the three of you for coming here and accepting our invite. So as Ismail mentioned, the underlying theme of the event is that Islam and Christianity both recognize and prioritize the common good and call believers to cooperate in its pursuit. By common good, we mean the value of wanting for others the good that we want for ourselves, and recognize that groups and individuals with diverse interests and beliefs nevertheless share a common interest in the flourishing of all. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, "None of you becomes a true believer until he or she loves for his or her brother, sister, that which he loves for him or herself." And it's also mentioned in the Bible in John 4:20. Whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother and sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. So God in both religions made loving and wanting good for others a condition to his love. The emphasis in our discussion will not be on the theology behind the value of common good. Rather, the emphasis will be on how our panelists put this value into practice in their legal vocations. That said, we are interested in how and why faith motivates you personally to dedicate your lives in helping others. So while we do not accept you to be expert in theology, except for Sister Mary Ellen, we would like to know how this your beliefs motivates you and shape your values in work. It is also important to understand that why you help those other faces are, as well as their own your own faith. This is to some extent such of you work for a faith-based legal advocacies in organizations, but at the same time you do help other faiths of people and members from the other faiths. So in sum, we are interested in exploring like the notion that one, it is fine to have different beliefs and opinions, and it is even like okay to disagree strongly with those beliefs. Second, having different beliefs does not preclude a belief in common good and working towards that. Indeed, Islam and Christianity both prioritize this value, as we said, and working for the good of members of one's own faith does not detract from or prevent the contributing to the common good. So, I don't know, we have all the bios on the brochures, so you can look at the bios you have.
Well, let's introduce them for the sake of those who are watching by video.
So I'll start with Attorney Layla Mustafa. She is an active member of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. During law school, she volunteered in Immigration and Legal Services program at Catholic Charities of Dallas. She was a student attorney at Southern Methodist University's San Vincent Family Law Clinic, where she was able to provide pro bono assistance for divorce and child custody matters. She served as a student attorney at the Southern Methodist University Actual Innocent Clinic, where she worked closely with the Dallas County Public Defender's Office to overturn wrongful convictions. And
we should also say that she's a staff attorney for the Constitutional Law Center for Muslims in America, and we're very, very grateful to them for giving up the time of such a valued staff member to come and speak. And I have to give a shout out to Khalil Meek, who is the director of the Muslim Legal Fund of America, which worked closely with them. A good friend of mine, and thankful to him for putting us in touch with Layla.
So thank you so much for coming. Sister Mary Ellen Burns. Sister Mary Allen is an executive director and an attorney at Absolute Immigration Services, a nonprofit that works with immigrants in the greater New Haven area to help them obtain U.S. citizenship, gain work authorization, unite with family members, becoming legal residents, and improve educational skills. AIS states that its goal is to build stronger immigration communities and emphasize that it accepts clients of all religious denominations. Sister Mary Ellen is a religious sister with the I don't know how to say that. Apostles. Thank you. Of the Sacred Heart of Jesus and practicing immigration attorney. Thank you so much for coming here and joining us. Attorney Sophia Sloan. Sophia is a staff attorney at the Loundle Christian Legal Center, LCLC, we'll go with that, a non-profit community-based organization in Chicago's North Loudon neighborhood. LCLC states that it is vision to raise up justly treated youth who are embraced with their families and community, restored from trauma, empowered to lead, and free from the criminal justice system. It states that it is mission to show and share the love of Jesus by providing legal services grounded in restorative justice for youth in the Landwell area. So I will leave it to the panelists to have 10 minutes of a talk for each.
Hi everyone. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Thanks for having me to the RFI, and I'm honored to be with such wonderful panelists, and thank you guys for coming out during exam season and everything. My topic is protecting religious practices in the workplace and in the public square. I just want to give a little bit of background about where I work, the Constitutional Law Center for Muslims in America. We are based in the Dallas, Texas area, but we are nationwide in federal courts and administrative hearings. And we have two primary missions. The first is to help Muslims that are being targeted, whether they're on the watch list or the FBI contacts them. They get disproportionately contacted based either on their faith or a mosque that they go to and know someone that is being targeted. It tends to encroach upon their life, so we end up helping them challenge those, whether it's a designation or the treatment. And then second, we help people and organizations practice their constitutionally protected right to worship. So employment law is one of the things we do, but it is not the only thing we do. I'm in the civil litigation department, and some of the cases we do include, along with employment discrimination, we handle no-fly list cases, watch list cases, people that have their security credentials removed based on those placements and therefore can't get jobs or can't purchase a gun and practice their constitutional right to carry. So there are certain things that those missions bleed into other areas of the law. We also help mosques and, if approached, other religious institutions that have issues purchasing land, or they may not be getting to make improvements upon the land, and it's based in part on the local community's reaction to them. So those are some examples of the civil litigation department. We also have immigration and criminal and a nonprofit compliance section. So we have a very broad overview. We are funded by a very generous grant from Muslim Legal Fund of America. So Khalil Meek is who Ismail was mentioning. He is the leader of Muslim Legal Fund of America. We're distinct organizations, but they fund us, and we're very grateful for that. So when it comes to employment law, there's really an alphabet soup of laws you would need to know to practice. But the primary one I wanted to talk to you about today was Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Additional laws that, if there's time, I will go into can include the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, which has a federal sister, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, that would apply more to employees that work at either state, local, or federal governments. and they didn't get a religious accommodation. That's where those would come up. Those laws also apply to prisoners and religious institutions in different ways, such as, like I said earlier, trying to purchase a piece of land, and for prisoners, and generally just being able to practice their religion in the prisons. So under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, employment discrimination is prohibited based on race, color, religion, sex, gender, and national origin. And it applies to workplaces with 15 employees or more. So if you are an aggrieved employee, an example of that would be that you experience disparate treatment. So you are treated differently than your employees of a different religion. So an example could be that you are being penalized for something that other employees are not penalized for. Like you come late every day, 10 minutes, but only the Muslim employee is being called out for that, and the others are not being written up. Another component is that your employer is failing to accommodate your religion. So if you are asking to have time during the day to pray and they are not accommodating you, that would be a violation. And then there's also retaliation. So if you suspect that you were being treated unfairly, even if you weren't, but then you filed a charge, which you would file with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, even if there wasn't discrimination at first, then they retaliated against you by demoting you or starting to write you up more often, that could be a claim as well. So I will hopefully be able to provide more examples of religious accommodations later on if there's time, but just to give you the spiel, employment discrimination can include refusing to accommodate an employee's sincerely held religious belief or practices unless the accommodation would impose an undue hardship. So there's different things you have to look at. It's not necessarily that all Muslims have to agree that halal food must be slaughtered by a Muslim. You know, some people are okay eating kosher meals, some are not. It's not about the mainstream view. It's about what the person sincerely believes. And in terms of an undue hardship, that is a case-by-case basis. It has, a minimal cost is not going to be an undue hardship to an organization, but depending on the size or the time of the year that an accommodation needs to occur, it can become an undue hardship, and therefore that's a situation where the reasonable accommodation won't be granted. So religious institutions, I often get the question, do I have to hire a Christian or not a Christian, but people of a different belief than me to do certain jobs, or do I have to have women, blah, 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 alone in the room? So there are certain very limited circumstances where that can be accommodated based on if you're a religious institution and depending on the nature of the job. So an entity is eligible for an exemption if it is organized for a religious purpose, it is engaged primarily in carrying out that religious purpose, holds itself out to the public as being for a religious purpose, and does not engage primarily or substantially in the exchange of goods or services for money beyond nominal amounts. So for that, there is no, I'm not going to get the quote right, but there is a quote saying there's no Christian way to mop a floor. So you can't discriminate based on that for a janitorial job unless there is one example where prayer requirements and the cleanliness requirements, if they can't necessarily be trained in that way, but there will be someone that will be able to understand and do that job. So that wouldn't necessarily mean you couldn't hire. You would have to hire a Muslim in the future, let's say. But for schools, for example, religious schools that can get dicey, I would say a math teacher does not need to hold the same religion as the school that they are teaching at, but a science teacher may have more of a fact issue. So in terms of the public space, there is one law that we like to let our community know about. That is the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, known as FACE. That actually came up in the abortion clinic context in the 90s when people were protesting at abortion clinics and were getting a little out of hand. There was a physician that was shot 3 times and killed. So this law came about in the Clinton administration and then has been expanded to apply to places of religious worship. And it states that it protects against the use of physical force, threat of physical force, or physical obstruction to intentionally injure, intimidate, interfere with, or attempt to injure, intimidate, or interfere with any person who is exercising or trying to exercise the First Amendment right of religious worship at a place of religious worship. So under FACE, it's important to know about this if you're active in your religious community, because if there are protests and people, hounding you to get in and they get unruly, it's important to know this act exists and to not only educate your community about it, but also law enforcement. We recommend contacting them ahead of time if you know a protest is coming, so they can set the parameters as to where people should stand. So threats of violence are not protected, but people, shouting, or they're protected under the law here, but people calling you names and everything, that's going to be a First Amendment right, a freedom of speech. But it's important to know that this exists just to get people controlled and have law enforcement there ahead of time. We recommend every religious institution gets cameras installed with sight and sound just in case something goes wrong. So I just wanted to give an overview of some of the law in the religious context. Obviously there's different types of discrimination, but we focus on the religious discrimination, as well as in the public space, just being aware of a tool in the law that can also help with graffiti against your institution or other markings there. And so in terms of why I work here and how my faith motivates my work, I'll be honest, I grew up as one of the only Muslims in my community. There wasn't a mosque at the time, and I was probably about 11 years old when 9/11 happened. So I remember distancing myself from my religion quite a bit and just growing up without that and wanting to learn about it in a way that wasn't as intimidating, it wasn't as direct. So I did join the Constitutional Law Center with that in mind, hoping that I would learn more about my faith and be motivated by my clients and how dedicated they are to their faith as well. And it has helped me grow closer to God and everything like that, but it's not just about that. It makes me feel good because, I see that I'm one of the only Muslims at my center. I'm actually the only licensed attorney at my center currently. So we have people of all faiths doing the same work, just as dedicated as I am. And when I was at Catholic Charities as well as a law student, it was very diverse. We had every faith under the sun, so it is rewarding work because religion is so personal to people. Even if you're not religious, it's part of your identity, I feel like. And you go to bed at night feeling very good about the work you do. Because even if you're not successful in one way, your clients very deeply appreciate it, more than they could if they were paying you for another service, I feel. And I know that what I'm doing is kind of one of those things where there are unseen good things happening from it. I may not see the result right away, and it may be frustrating at times, but I know that there will be systemic change resulting from people like us doing the work we do. And even if it doesn't make as big of a dent in the checkbook, it is very rewarding. So I fully recommend it. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Just jump right in. Hi. Yeah, as mentioned, my name's Sister Mary Ellen Burns. I run, I laugh, I don't know if you noticed, anytime the title of executive director is used, even though it's one that I provided, because right now our office, in addition to myself and another young sister who is with us part-time for about another month, we have 2 employees. So I'm a master of all I survey with that. And the organization Apostle Immigrant Services, I realize that some of the words that I would just use so frequently, probably to many in this audience seem a little bizarre, so I'm going to break them down. I'm a member of a religious congregation, a Roman Catholic women's religious congregation called the Apostles of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And even for a number of Christian denominations, that phrase may be a little bit not something you'd hear every day. Apostles probably are best known as the closest followers of Jesus, but the word apostle comes from a meaning to be sent, one who is sent. In the Catholic tradition, we love a lot of devotional images and reflections. And so when we speak about the Sacred Heart of Jesus, what we are focusing on is what for certainly the Jewish tradition of Jesus's day was seen as the center not only of love, Happy Valentine's Day, but of thought and will. So when we focus on someone's heart, we focus on what is most essential to their being. And as Christians, Catholic Christians, if we look at the images of Jesus, his actions and his words in the scriptures, we would have to say that love is the center of his being. And it is love directed by God the Father, love directed to God the Father, and that is what sent him. And so my religious community was founded about, 125 years ago next month, to share with others that image of Christ who at his center is love. Not judgment, not condemnation, not 115 commandments, but love. And to the extent he exercises judgment, issues commandments, tells truth, the motivation for that is love. And the way we are to do this is service. Certainly one can do exactly what I'm doing now and speak about it, but people don't learn so much from what we say as what we do. So that is our center motivating force, to share with others the love which we experience in him. And of course, one of the phrases of Catholic Charities and many immigration services is, we do not serve people because they are Catholic. We serve people because we are. In response to those who are like, why don't you help, why don't you help X, Y, and Z instead of ABC religions? Well, because we don't do it for their religion, we do it for ours. So our little office provides largely family-based and humanitarian-based legal services. My two other colleagues are what's called accredited representatives, accredited by the Department of Justice, and our agency is a recognized agency by the Department of Justice so that they may represent people in front of the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services and also consulates and seeking visas, assisting people in those processes. This is a depressing thing to say to law students. They did not go to law school. And yet, all the blood, sweat, and tears you have, they could do the same thing that I'm doing. So what do? We do largely helping people obtain legal status for their family members, bring family members here, get work authorization based on some of the humanitarian things. Certainly asylee and refugee status are both humanitarian statuses. We don't help people get those statuses, but we do help those in that status to bring their family members here, to become legal permanent residents, to become citizens, and through that establish that their children too are citizens. Other types of humanitarian status are those who obtain immigration benefits, work authorization, legal status, eventually green cards, because they've been victims of certain types of crime, because they are young people who have experienced abuse, neglect, or abandonment by one or both of their parents, and then citizenship. Okay, saying that something's rewarding is nice. I will illustrate that it's rewarding. At some point during the day today, a plane is going to land in John F. Kennedy Airport that had its origin in the Sudan. And among the people getting out of that plane are a young woman and a 2-year-old child, her son, and the son of a man who will be waiting in almost uncontrollable enthusiasm at the end of that passageway that one path comes down after going through immigration and customs at John F. Kennedy Airport. The woman is the wife that he married 2 years and 9 months ago. The baby is his little boy, whom he has seen on Skype, but whom he has never held. Our office has been working with that family for almost 3 years for this day of reunion. Something that my parents took for granted, I took for granted as a child. I don't think anyone who hasn't gone through that, the delays, if something could go wrong, it went wrong with this man's case. The struggles, the sleeplessness, the painful anguish of seeing this little baby on his phone day after day, seeing all the milestones a 2-year-old has achieved without being able to congratulate him, without being able to support him as he's taking those first tentative steps, because you are thousands of miles away. That's going to be over. Our work is very rewarding, and wow, our pay is little, but not for everybody doing immigration law, but it is, I have to say, one sees the joy and the solicitude of our Father, of our God most merciful in moments like that. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I'm a staff attorney at the Lawndale Christian Legal Center, LCLC, which is a neighborhood-based nonprofit on the west side of Chicago. So we provide free legal and social services to young people charged with crimes. Most of our clients are between the ages of 12 and 24. And they all live in North Lawndale, which is one of the most underserved and disenfranchised parts of Chicago. The poverty rates and the levels of gun violence are inordinately high. And the neighborhood is simultaneously over-policed and underprotected. So the children that we serve, the young people, are routinely stopped and searched by police without real justification, in their car with their friends, riding their bike home, sitting on their own front porch. But when they or one of their friends is shot and killed, which is tragically not uncommon in our neighborhood, 3 out of 4 times no one will be arrested. And that leads a lot of our young people to feel that they have to take their safety into their own hands the only way they know how. And most of our clients suffer from some kind of trauma and are acquainted with gun violence in some way. So there is suffering in North Lawndale. There's poverty and violence, and there are also block parties and schools and neighbors that care about each other. And there are community organizations that have grown up out of the neighborhood and work to meet the needs of their neighbors. And I like to think that if Jesus lived in Chicago in 2019, he would hang out in North Lawndale. LCLC is affiliated with Lawndale Community Church, which also started a neighborhood health organization. We are a Christian organization, although that doesn't mean that all of the staff are necessarily religious, and you certainly don't have to be Christian to get services there. But it means that there are certain values sort of inspire and inform the way that we interact with our clients and provide services. And the way I see it is that we take it seriously when Jesus says that to love God is to love your neighbor as yourself. LCLC has a holistic model, which means that the young people we work with get both a dedicated lawyer and a case manager on their team. And the case manager helps them with some of the underlying issues that are often leading them to being involved with the criminal justice system in the first place. So sometimes that's education, housing, mental health, drug abuse, family instability, lack of employment opportunities. That's the person who sort of walks with them, takes them to school, to the DMV, to wherever they need to go to get some of that stuff done. And at LCLC, clients are not seen as sort of discrete legal problems, but as the whole person who's messy and complicated and worthy. And the holistic model is so important because the criminal justice system is inherently intensely reductive. And by insisting on the humanity of our clients, we resist the narrative of a system that would reduce them to a charge, a booking number, demographic shorthand. It's a system that reduces them oftentimes to some of the worst moments of their lives. So what does insisting on human dignity look like in practice? Every day for our legal team can be a little bit different. Sometimes we're prepping for trial, cross-examining police officers usually, taking pictures of crime scenes, taking pictures of cameras. Some days we write motions arguing that our clients' constitutional rights are violated when they were searched without justification. Sometimes it means sitting with a client at the office or in the Cook County Jail and asking them difficult questions about the pain that they've experienced and the trauma, and then trying to express some of that, their pain and their resilience, in a letter or a pleading that might convince a prosecutor or a judge to give them a second chance, or third or fourth or seventh, because people are complicated, but it doesn't mean that we should throw them away. Our clients are more than the stories that we tell about them, but they are certainly not less than that. And some days it means just spending all day in Westlaw reading complex procedural case law. And some nights it's going to a police station and helping a teenager invoke his right to remain silent. Sometimes it's making 6 phone calls in a row to the sheriff's office so that your client who's on electronic monitoring can go to work, or the laundromat, or to the hospital with his 4-year-old for eye surgery, and without getting rearrested. Sometimes it means arguing with police officers in an emergency room because you were told that your 14-year-old client was shot and now you can't get any more information. And I had that day a couple of weeks ago. It turned out he was okay. It was a different teenager who had been killed in the park that morning. But I was with his mom when we both thought that it was him. And so I've been thinking a lot about kind of what has led me to a place where I'm participating in a moment like that. And so I do want to talk a little bit about how faith motivates me personally to do the work. The Christian Bible exhorts believers to bear one another's burdens, mourn with those who mourn, and rejoice with those who rejoice. And this is a call to a radical kind of empathy. And I think it encapsulates some of the Christian call to work toward the common good, and which is to link for a moment another person's well-being to your own. And that's a very difficult thing to do. And I'm not sure humans can really do it without a great deal of grace. Especially when the call to empathy, to radical empathy, and recognizing how connected we all are, transcends the comfortable groups and hierarchies and social divisions that we get accustomed to. In the description of Jesus' ministry in the New Testament, he does some teaching in the halls of power, but he spends a lot of his time with some of the most marginalized social groups, people that others feared or scorned or ridiculed, who would be considered the least worthy in society. But Jesus saw God in them, and he said, "Whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me." He said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the merciful, for mercy will be shown to them." The first will be last, and the last will be first. And maybe the social hierarchies that we participate in don't align with God's heart for this world. That's my paraphrase. Micah, one of the Old Testament prophets, wrote about what God the Father desired of those who would worship him. He said, "God has told you what is good. Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God." And when we see people as beloved, as children of God, and view them through a lens of justice and mercy, we can't discard them. And we remember their inherent worth, we affirm their human dignity, and we have to seek restoration of the places that are broken. And in my opinion, Christianity demands a certain kind of moral humility that upsets our comfortable notions of crime and punishment and good and evil. And Jesus reminds us to consider our own shortcomings and to let go of stones of accusation instead of throwing them at people who have already known pain that we can't imagine. And to remember that everyone is more than the darkness they have faced. When Jesus was asked, who is the neighbor that we're supposed to love, he told a story about people from incredibly different social groups who should have been afraid or ashamed to talk to each other. And one was in desperate need, and the other one helped him at great cost to himself. And I think it's interesting that the one who needed help was the one that most of Jesus' listeners would have identified with. And the one who performed the act of great sacrificial love was from a group that they would have considered less than, or would have been raised to look down on. And so systematically, what does it mean to affirm and insist on human dignity in the criminal justice system? We talk a lot at our office about electronic monitoring, pretrial detention, as not being an alternative to incarceration, recognizing that imprisoning someone in their home is a serious infringement on their liberty, especially when that home is not always safe or heated or has food in it, or when they're parents and their kid has to go to the hospital or just runs out in the street and they're stuck on the porch afraid they'll get arrested if they go after them. We talk about money bail and the fact that there are many people in the United States right now who have not been convicted of a crime, who are in jails because they and their families are too poor to post bond. We talk about the criminalization of mental illness and homelessness, and the insistence on punitive practices when they have been shown not to affect recidivism rates, but instead entrench people in feelings of hopelessness and criminal cultures that leave them unlikely to trust or participate in social life. We spend countless dollars on policing and prosecution and imprisoning certain groups of people, and we don't invest in education and mental health and job programs and the kind of supports that have been shown to actually reach some of the outcomes that we're looking for. So there are a lot of ways that our criminal justice system could be made less cruel, more humane, and more like Jesus' heart. And if you want a reading list, you can email me. Ultimately, I think that to believe in the God of peace and justice and mercy that I see in the Christian Bible does mean to see the transformation of criminal justice in this country as both urgent and imperative. And to do so, we must remember that justice without mercy is not of God, and have the humility to understand that we can't really know what anyone is truly capable of, for good or bad, including ourselves. So I don't know where trying to follow God in my legal career is going to take me, but I do think my God is in Chicago and in North Lawndale, and I believe that by getting to work there, I'm learning about love and grace and strength and justice, and so I'm very grateful for that.
Thank you so much. Okay. So I would love to start. Thank you all for the insightful and faith restoring talk. I'll start with Attorney Layla. So because your work covers issues of workplace and public accommodations of religious freedom or religious practices, as well as the significance of the issue for many Muslims, Jews, Christians, even Sikhs, all different faiths and religion, would you speak on protecting religious practices in the workplace and the public sphere?
Absolutely. Primarily the issue is religious accommodation. So cases we've had, which can there are parallels in other religions. For example, time off work to go to a religious service. So for us, Friday prayer is a requirement to go to the mosque, particularly for men, to attend Friday prayer. So as well as the 5 daily prayers, which can fall within the workday. So there can be parallels to other religions, such as a Seventh-day Adventist would need to not work on Saturday, I believe. even though our clients are primarily Muslim, some of the issues we face will impact others. And so we would, for example, if a Seventh-day Adventist approached us, we would love to take their case. But religious accommodations also can have to do with your wardrobe. So if you're working in a place where, I believe there's an Abercrombie and Fitch case. We didn't take this, and we wouldn't be able to because we deal with government agency type cases, federal lawsuits only. But there was a woman who wanted to work at Abercrombie and Fitch, and they weren't letting her because she wears the hijab. And they were saying, well, we have a policy where everyone has to wear our clothes and subscribe to a certain look. And the court found that she was still able to wear the clothing. It didn't impact anything just because she wore the scarf. But that's just one consideration, as well as beards have been litigated quite a bit, especially in the prison context. Some Muslim men feel they need to grow a beard, not all, because everyone interprets everything differently and holds to things differently. But because some beards can be medically necessary, the military, for example, has a rule that if it's medically necessary, they can keep the beard. Well, if you're recognizing it for them, you can't say that it's a security thing to have a certain length beard. So in terms of religious accommodations in our cases, though, it is primarily dealing with Friday prayer, as well as accommodations during the month of Ramadan, which I know is approaching. So some people want to be able to, let's say, I want to come to work earlier and leave earlier. I want to come to work later and leave later. Usually your employer can accommodate that, but they don't have to necessarily offer the accommodation you want. So I know at our center, an accommodation is offered to arrive earlier and leave earlier during the month of Ramadan. But with religious accommodations, one thing you have to consider is that undue hardship, burdensome thing that, oh man, this is getting in the way. But it is true, if it causes an undue hardship, then they may not have to accommodate your religion. So you try to think of solutions where it wouldn't cause anyone to work any extra hours, because you can't have someone else be working extra hours, and you can't cause a large cost to your organization. But when it comes to Friday prayer, for example, if you aggregated your breaks during the week, you would be able to have the 2 hours you need to go to the mosque. So those are some things that come up that I will say there's a caveat, though, because if you're in a union and you're an employee, let's say you're a teacher and there's a teachers union and there's a collective bargaining agreement in place, that can get in your way because it is assumed that certain things were already litigated at that stage. So if you're saying, I need a compressed work schedule so that I won't come to work on Friday, and I don't work Friday, but I have 3 consecutive days off, they don't necessarily have to provide you that schedule to where you want to have Friday and Saturday off. They may say, well, Thursday and Friday, or they may split up your days, and they may say that it's because you're not senior. One of the considerations a judge will have in this context will be seniority. So if you're trying to get an accommodation such as certain days off that only senior people get to have, that may get in your way if there's a collective bargaining agreement in place. But for the most part, those are the kinds of accommodations that come up in our work. So.
Thank you so much, Sister Marianne. So your life and work demonstrate the values that we want to emphasize on this panel. Can you tell us more about the connections between your work, faith, and daily life as a nun? You are a formally trained religious authority, and we would love to hear your theological and philosophical perspective on working for the common good as like the main theme.
Okay, I have to say that I'm actually have pretty minimal theological training. A lot of our sisters have master's degree in theology, and I have some college courses. But it's a delight to speak about this intersection. Okay, so to start with the idea of the common good, the Catholic Church has some biblically derived principles of social justice. And one of them, and the one that we have to start with, is about the worth of the human person. And one finds that in both the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, as well as, of course, the New Testament. And in the Hebrew Bible, starting with the first chapter of Genesis and the first account of creation, we hear that God created the human person, male and female, in God's image and likeness. And looking upon creation, having created the human person, God found it very good. Image and likeness. If we each here are in the image and likeness of our Creator, you know, we are a little intersection of the sacred and the quotidian, aren't we? And therefore, the human person's life is, although not an absolute good, because there's always conflicts, right? And that's why we hope all to get paid as lawyers to get into the interstices and the interpretations. But it's the closest to an absolute good in Catholic social justice teaching, because it comes directly from God. And the New Testament reference is pretty obvious. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. And the Greek word for flesh is a fleshy word indeed. It's almost the same word you'd use for what you would buy in the meat store. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. If God Almighty deigned to take on, for real, all the ways that we are but sin, indeed, there is an immense value to the human person. And that means that every human person has a right, this far away from absolute, to everything they need to live, and to live with dignity. And that means they have a right to food, they have a right to clean water, they have a right to at least basic education and health care, they have a right to shelter, they have a right to clothing, everything that is needful for human life. And although Catholic social justice teaching recognizes nations, a relatively late concept in the development of humanity, nation, it is not created by God. It is subordinate to the right of the human person. And therefore, in my own little specialty, immigration, my current specialty, one of the teachings and our view of the common good, helped immensely by all that Apollo program that let us see the earth with, guess what, no boundaries, except maybe parts of the Great Wall of China. Those boundaries are artificial and created by us. And although a nation has an inherent right to protect its boundaries, that right is subordinate to the right of the human person if they don't have what they need to live that dignified human life in, let's say El Salvador or Mexico. They have a right to come to a place where they will find those things. They also have a right to be able to get it in their place of origin. But okay. So that's part of the theological underpinning of the specific ideas about immigration law, which the Catholic bishops pretty consistently promote. You know, it's a little known aspect of Catholic teaching, I think, in the public sphere. But that's really part of it. My own passion for being an advocate, and prior to doing immigration work, I represented tenants in the South Bronx and in Washington Heights and in Manhattan. I helped people get access to welfare and food stamps. Comes from that encounter, I believe, with the Word of God, which as a nun, well, I'm not a nun, I'm a sister, you hear a lot of. in our daily prayer, in our participation in the public worship of the church, and at Mass, and in our own private prayer. Particularly with the prophet Amos, who slams down hard on the wealthy of his day, who, in one quote, sold the poor for a pair of sandals, as well as from the teachings of Jesus. And I will also just have to get in there that both the Old and the New Testament, but particularly the Old Testament, it is a running theme to the people that they will be judged by how they treat the trifecta of the most vulnerable, widow, orphans, and the alien in their midst. And then Jesus, in that same parable that you quoted, Matthew 25, when he's talking about the least, one of the things he says is, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. So those things kind of inform my my passion for the work that I'm doing.
Thank you so much. So after we're gonna hear from Attorney Sophie, you have any question? Oh, okay. So I was gonna say, if you have any question, keep them in mind. You can ask our panelists after. So the underlying assumption is that there are fundamental challenges within the criminal justice system. Can you speak about what these challenges are, what could be done to make it more ethical, and how what you do is in your work help lessen those consequences, and like from a public policy perspective, like any change of public policy that you could be done.
One sort of principle, theory, practice I like to talk about is called restorative justice, which comes from sort of a variety of traditions, indigenous traditions with other kind of spiritual elements have been kind of layered on, but the basic idea is that it reframes the concept of crime from being a harm against the state to being a harm to relationships between people. And the end goal is, the question that's asked is not what law was broken, but what harm was done. And then the solution is not what punishment should be imposed, but how do we make it right? And there have been movements in various countries, Australia, New Zealand in particular, Portugal, to start instituting restorative justice practices as part of their actual system. And that has not really taken place in the US as of yet. But there are ways that it's starting in Chicago, for example, in North Lawndale. LCLC was part of sort of a pilot project to institute a community court, the restorative justice community court. It's basically a diversion program where instead of being prosecuted in the traditional system, the prosecutors can choose to send you to the RJCC instead. And there is a judge there, and it's still part of the state, which is kind of, there's a lot of issues. It's very tricky getting that all sorted out. But the young people in that court, they get a chance to sit in what we call peace circles. And actually every employee at LCLC is trained in the circle keeping process because it's the value of our organization. Peace circles are inherently egalitarian. There's a talking piece and everybody gets a chance to speak and or not speak as they want to. All decisions are made sort of communally. There's not this imposition of power from above on a person. So in many ways, it's a complete opposite of our criminal justice system. And it's very complicated trying to figure out how to incorporate some of those values. But in our work, there's the court. I mentioned a little bit about some of the mitigation letters we write, and that has the same sort of spirit, and the other services that we provide to try and help people get connected with jobs and mental health services, and see what is the harm that's been done to you to bring you to this place. What are the ways that you can begin to recognize, take ownership, and move forward what you've been through, what you've done, and then trying to express that to the courts. And it's an uphill battle sometimes, because the system is not designed that way at all. The other thing I want to talk about is collateral consequences. One of the things I was kind of getting at in my speech is how we have created this sort of subclass of people that are considered not full citizens, sometimes not fully human in all the ways that they have. They lose the right to vote. They can't get jobs. It's okay to discriminate against them in employment. It's public housing. There are all sorts of things that, once you have a felony conviction in particular, whole areas of public life and economic life are shut down to you. And so a lot of what we do is try and keep our kids from getting that first felony conviction. And there are various probation programs, and where if you sort of prove that you can stay on a good path for a while, they won't actually enter it. But those can be hard to get. And so I think as a policy matter, because these are people who have in theory paid their debt already, right? They've served what was imposed as a supposedly just sentence already, and then they come back and they're faced with more barriers to re-entering productive life. And so there are various it's a state by state kind of situation usually, but I think that's another thing that would make the criminal justice system more ethical.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I wanted to ask each of you, not to put you on the spot because I didn't tell you what this question was going to be before we started, but it just occurred to me as you were talking that each of you deals with human beings, on the ground in your work. If you could think of what is the most meaningful case that you specifically each have dealt with, either the most hopeful or the most just tragic, anything that sent you home thinking about that and that you continue to think about. Maybe we could start with Layla and each of you.
I have two because I can't pick.
Sure.
But I'll be quick. It's kind of similar to the story you told, a family reunification type case. It's not necessarily border separation, but it was no-fly list. The father was here and his family was in Turkey, and his children were 2 and 4 years old, and he went over a year without seeing them, and it was causing a strain to his marriage, and we challenged his no-fly list designation. And in general, when we do these challenges, it has to do with the due process, the lack of due process. They don't tell you why you're on the list. They put you on it and don't tell you you're on it until you need to travel, and then you find out, okay, I'm on this list, I can't fly, I'm separated from my family. So we were able to, by just pushing them to give us the reasons, which they did not want to provide, it ended up resulting in him getting off the no-fly list, and he will now be able to be reunited with his family. And especially with young children, it's just, we saw the pictures, and we ended up sending it to the government saying, these are his children, we were wanting him to get back with them. And then there's a current case that's ongoing, but it is with a Palestinian nonprofit and their funding organization, and some individuals that have been targeted in an alter ego successor liability lawsuit. And the groups that were there before that got stuck with a judgment of $156 million did not have the legal resources to really defend themselves, and it just makes me feel good to know we're able to help them at least have an adequate defense, because they're saying that these people are liable for this judgment when none of them were sued in the original lawsuit. And we feel that it is probably to suppress their speech as a Palestinian group. So that is another case that's very rewarding for us.
Obviously, I can't pick one, but I will stick with one. Another aspect of our work, as I mentioned, is working with people who have been crime victims. And so there is a statute, a part of the Immigration Nationality Act that provides a temporary legal status called U status, because it's that paragraph in non-immigrant visa section of the law, to people who have been victims of certain designated crimes, which are typically crimes of violence or threats against a person. And allows them to get temporary legal status if they can show that they cooperated with law enforcement. The only way to show that is getting law enforcement to certify that, and that they suffered substantial harm as a result of that crime. And then once they get in that status, after 3 years, they can apply to get legal permanent residence and from there citizenship. So the kind of paradigmatic crime for this is domestic violence, and it was the Domestic Violence Advocacy community that got this law, which is an aspect of the Violence Against Women Act, instituted in the first place. So one of my clients who came to us was a woman who had 5 children, and she came to us relatively soon after she had separated from the man who had been the father of the 4 youngest children, and who for more than a decade had had her in a relationship that was abusive in every aspect. And psychologically, emotionally, physically, sexually, suppression of everything, and made her see herself as, you were speaking of worthy, completely unworthy, completely useless, completely undesirable, etc. And at a certain point, his extreme battering of her, well, sadly enough, it wasn't extreme, I guess, compared to some battering, but, a significant battering of her came to light, and she followed up with the police, etc. So we were able to get certification from the government that she had cooperated, and eventually she did get U status, and I'm happy to say last fall she got her green card. But what made it what makes it particularly striking for me was having seen her then and having seen her now, because she clearly had suffered from trauma, really lifelong trauma, and when I met her, she was almost scary because as part of, she was provided with domestic violence counseling so that she'd learn to see this relationship in a new light. And so she realized that she had been, to put it mildly, hoodwinked for a dozen years into believing that she was garbage and had put up with it. And so in addition to hopefully seeing her own dignity, she was also angry. So she was kind of a little bit scary sometimes. And also she frequently would be telling me, I think I'm going to get evicted. She was all of a sudden supporting 5 children as an undocumented person. And having also to take care of those 5 children, who at that point were still, kind of young. So her work options were limited, to say the least. And our office doesn't have a way of giving people income, giving them a way to, legally get work, yes, but actually giving them money, no. But she managed. She struggled. She still, of course, struggles. But I saw her when she was getting her green card, and she was so excited. When she first got work authorization, she burst into tears. This woman who seemed so hard and angry, and her vulnerability really showed up. But when she came to get her green card, she told me about how her oldest child had been awarded a full scholarship to a local college. And of course my client hadn't gone to high school, let alone college. And then she showed me pictures. Now, first of all, she had a cell phone, not the flip kind that I had at that time, but the kind that probably most of us now in this room have. She had an apartment. She had a job that she was getting paid, regular paycheck. She was filed taxes. And when she was showing me a picture, what she showed me was a picture of her family at a restaurant. It wasn't an elegant restaurant. It was a chain restaurant, but where you sit down and get served. And they were celebrating her son's birthday. And, it was something that, I certainly would have taken for granted, that my family could go out to once in a while to a not particularly elegant restaurant, but, where we could order off a menu and celebrate a happy event. But I compared her then to the woman I had met, who was afraid month by month she'd be on the street, And we were, a little part of getting her there. But what made it kind of almost more rewarding was that we were a little part of getting her there. And she was the rest of the part, with God's grace, was the rest of it that got her there. And she was truly not empowered, but a woman who had discovered and continues to discover the power that she has. So that was.
Yeah, I almost hesitate to share the story that stands out to me because it's kind of complicated. I mean, the thing about human beings is they're also capable of terrible things. And I think Christianity does give a framework for holding some of that tension of the worthiness of human beings and also their capacity to inflict great harm on each other. But the person I'm thinking about, I met when I was a law student, because LCLC does do these kind of cases right now, but the clinic I worked with at the University of Chicago Law School was doing resentencings for juvenile life without parole clients. So these were people who had committed murders usually when they were teenagers and had been sentenced to die in prison. This man was 13 when he went to prison, and he was like 44 when I met him. Almost 40 maybe. But the 90s in Chicago were an extremely chaotic and violent period in certain neighborhoods. The sort of top leadership of a lot of the gangs got taken out in this big sting operation, went to prison, and all the kids were left in these splintered groups with easy access to weapons saying, hold this block. And so this young man, this 12-year-old boy who'd grown up in an abusive and neglectful environment, had killed somebody and been sentenced to die in prison. And it was ruled in 2008, I think, that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life sentences without the possibility of parole are now unconstitutional to impose on juveniles. You can still do a discretionary life sentence without parole for someone under the age of 18 if you find that it's particularly, if there are certain factors present. And so there were maybe 75 people in Illinois who were eligible to be resentenced after that. And this man was one of them. And so as a student, we didn't do that much in court, but one of our main jobs was going to visit the clients. And so every week or two, I would go with one of the other students and just talk to him. And because we learn about his life, in a resentencing hearing, it's not really like a trial where the rules of evidence aren't as strict, and you're really just trying to the state prevents aggravation and you present mitigation. And so we had a re-entry plan for him. The social worker in the clinic had found a place that helps people transition out of housing, and there, you get records of their whole life. They're huge files, and just meeting this person who had grown up in prison was really kind of transformative for me because he was just such a good guy. Like he was so thoughtful and kind and compassionate, and he read everything that we could send him, and he understood what he had done, and he had done a lot of personal work to try to move forward, and I don't know if I want to use the word repent, but he had done a lot of sort of inner work around coming to grips with the harms that he had caused. And he's currently still in prison, but he has an out date now. So he went in at 12 thinking he was never going to see freedom again. And now, I think he's got 2 more years. He was resentenced to, I don't know, I think it'll come out to be like 35 years or 40 years in prison. Yes, so he's been punished, and to me that sort of illustrates the complexity of the work and the human condition, and this sort of principle that I keep coming back to, that everyone is more than the worst thing they've ever done, which is something Brian Stevenson says. If you want a book to read, I do recommend his book Just Mercy. He does death penalty cases.
Actually, it was our requirement for my class to read it.
Great.
So most of us did read it.
Good. Yeah. So he's somebody that I
Yeah.
look up to, and that phrase sticks out to me.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Like, thank you for all the panelists. Spiritual, great. And now we can open it to Q&A. If anybody have a question to any of our panelists or to all of them, please don't hesitate. Can you repeat the question so it will be recorded?
I just wanted to add to your point that you said it was 2008 when they ruled that it was
Well, and I think-
unconstitutional.
Sorry, I think I should correct myself. I think it was actually 2008 when, for nonviolent offenses, it was ruled unconstitutional. I think it was actually later than that for violent offenses.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add that it wasn't until I believe it was 2006 that the courts held that it was unconstitutional to give the death penalty to minors, and at that time, a minor was only someone under the age of 16. So I work right now for the Center for Children's Advocacy, and one of the things we do, and we've recently been successful, is that we have pushed for the age of minority to be older. And Connecticut, as well as where I'm from, Louisiana, we were some of the last states to have the age pushed from 16 to 18. In fact, in Louisiana, it just happened at the beginning of March,
Oh,
I'm
wow.
happy to say. And now in Connecticut, we are advocating that actually the age should be pushed to 21 because of studies based on the brain development of adolescents, as well as, in many states there's just not adequate detention type centers for rehabilitation as opposed to punishment. For example, in Connecticut, there was one major detention center for juvenile offenders, and it recently closed. And so what happened to all those children was that they were either sent to the adult prisons where they were separated from the older inmates, but they were still could be influenced by them. And then the other ones went to detention centers, like the jail where you would go for lockup if you were just arrested. And they would wait there for a week, and then at the end of every week they would have a hearing to see if they needed to be detained longer or if they would be able to move forward in the process. So some of those very young children spent weeks and weeks just in your regular jail cell. And it's definitely something that I believe worthy of advocating.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the age of minority. Illinois actually is one of the better in my opinion, states on the juvenile jurisdiction. Illinois, I think, was the first state to have a designated juvenile court in the early 20th century, and the age of minority is 18, but juvenile court jurisdiction extends until the age of 21, and not a lot of states have that. And we talk a lot about adolescent brain development in our work, in our mitigation letters, and scientists tend to agree that it's really not until like 24, 25 that the centers of the brain responsible for impulse control and decision making and future-oriented, like thinking about consequences, aren't really fully developed until that age, which is why 12 to 24 is kind of our clientele bracket. But those are really important points.
Any other questions? Okay, so I'm going to wrap up and we'll be able to go eat. First of all, one of the things that Islamic Relief wanted us to do in this program was to offer a opportunity for two people from the audience to get together and go out for coffee. People from two different faiths who might not normally have gotten together or might not have met one another had they not come here. So there was a drawing done, and so the two names that we have come up with, and we're going to pay for them to go out and eat. First one is Shalim Yaqub. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Shalim Yaqub. Oh, okay. All right, great. Okay. And the other one is Ghufran.
Ghufran Labavidi, she's over here.
Okay.
Congratulations.
Okay. Awesome. Okay.
What's your name so they would...
Okay. Beautiful. Thank you. Beautiful.
Beautiful.
Okay, so we have our two people. So Miriam, you can.
Congratulations for both of you.
Yes, Miriam, you can give that to them. Not necessarily now.
Because we're gonna
Yeah, because we're gonna eat, but we'll get to that
so
too. Okay. Yes, and so I wanted to just to wrap up first of all by thanking our panelists for coming and giving us such a rich discussion of their work, and also to thank them and to ask that God bless them for what they're doing and give them happiness in this life and the next. And I wanted to mention first of all, one thing that really struck me with what you said, Sophia, that everyone is more than the worst thing they've ever done. Where's that from? Did you?
Yeah, that's from Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy. He's a death penalty advocate. He's actually behind some of those Supreme Court cases that led to those laws we were talking about being held unconstitutional.
Yeah, and I think that's something that each one of us can personally relate to. Because how terrible would that be if we were, each one of us, defined by the worst thing we'd ever done? And we've all done bad things. So I wanted to mention something about, we've heard a lot of very beautiful passages from the Bible and from the Christian Bible. And I wanted to say that these are universal values, in that without these values that you guys so beautifully expressed, if those values are not universally held by everyone, then we really can't live together. There's no way that we can all live together without having empathy for others besides ourselves. If we go around as narcissists, only concerned about what's good for me, then a society can't function that way. And more importantly, what is so we acknowledge that someone without faith, any faith at all, or can certainly be a good person. There's no question about that. But there's something that our founding fathers saw in faith that made it that they understood that it was so important as the basis of our society and for our nation. So they wrote into the Declaration of Independence that every human being was created equal, and that our rights are endowed into us by our Creator, are endowed by our Creator, which is another way of saying that, or expressing the dignity, the inherent dignity of each human being, regardless of what religion they are. Even if they don't believe in God at all, God has given that person dignity, even if they don't believe in the source of that, that the source of that dignity is their Creator. So I wanted to mention that the Prophet Muhammad said that each of us are. He said that God created Adam in His image, and he said, and the Quran says, وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ, and we have given dignity or nobility to the children of Adam. So we either follow this and believe it, and believe in the inherent dignity of every human being, or we deteriorate into an every person for himself type of society. And we can see the results. What happens in some of these religion has in religion's name a great deal of evil has been perpetrated, as we saw in the horrific attacks on the Christian worshippers over the Easter past. But religion has also, or as we saw in different things throughout history, but religion has also been and primarily been a source of great good. And so that's what we're here to celebrate today, and that's what we're here to promote. And so again, thank every one of you. We thank every one of you for coming. We thank our panelists, and we hope that they've inspired you, if not to live your life, live your faith in public, then at least to have an appreciation and empathy yourselves for those who are doing this work. Thank you, and let's eat.
Let's eat.